All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be on you all. We've got an exciting episode today here on the Muslim Metaphysician channel. We've got a discussion between Dr. Ryan Mullins and Dr. Joshua Sijuwade. We're going to be talking about the Christian doctrine of the divine processions, which is related to the Nicene Creed and this idea that the Son and the Spirit are begotten and inspired of the Father. You guys should be familiar with these guys. They've been on here a couple times before. And in interest of time, we're just going to kind of jump into things. But I mentioned it in the text chat earlier. Please try to remain respectful. And we're probably not going to engage as much with comments or questions from the audience unless you have a burning question. You can pose it as a super chat, and we'll try to get to it. But this is mainly going to be a discussion between Josh and Dr. Mullins, and I'm just kind of a bystander here, just watching and interestingly listening. So, with that being said, guys, how you guys doing?
Pretty good today.
Great, yeah, doing very well.
Oh, I'm glad to have you guys on here again. I did post in the description of this video, I posted two discussions that I had with Ryan and Josh individually on the subject. So people feel free to check that out afterwards if you haven't already, because they kind of represented their views on this, independently. And now we're having a joint discussion where they try to hash these things out a little bit. So this should be really interesting, and I've been looking forward to it for a while now. With that being said, Ryan, why don't you start us off by telling us about the basic conditions for the Trinity?
Mm-hmm. So in several different works, I've identified 5 different conditions that are distilled from the early church creeds. These are pretty vague, and each Christian is going to need to develop them further in order to have like a robust doctrine of the Trinity. Otherwise, your doctrine of the Trinity is going to be pretty anemic. But here are the 5 conditions. So I call them T1 through T5. So T1 says there are 3 divine persons. T2, the divine persons are not numerically identical to each other. And T3, which is the doctrine of homoousios, the divine persons share the same divine essence. T4 is monotheism. The divine persons are related in such a way that there is only one God and not 3 gods. And then T5 is the traditional doctrine of processions, which says that the Father causes the Son and the Holy Spirit to exist. There's going to be different ways to spell each of those out, but those are kind of the basics from the early church creeds.
Right. Sorry about that. my mic was muted there. So I think right now we should go through some of the conditions that Ryan has spelled out. But Josh, why don't you tell us about how you understand the first condition, and then Ryan can, follow you on that. What are the divine processions as far as you understand them, Josh?
Okay. So I do affirm exactly what Ryan said with T1 to T5. I think they all capture the central elements of the doctrine. Specifically with T1, so I will affirm there to be 3 divine persons, and I'll take persons in the modern sense of the word, because person, specifically in the Trinitarian context, is quite ambiguous. But I'll take it simply to be that they exemplify properties that are necessary and sufficient for being persons, such as self-consciousness, a first-person perspective, certain mental properties that enable them to have sort of a token distinct consciousness. So I will affirm the 3 persons in the modern sense of the word. And I understand them to be divine in the specific way that they exemplify. So each of them exemplify a divinity universal. So there's a universal divinity. Specifically, I identify this divinity universal as that of omnipotence. So they each exemplify this specific property, and that makes them divine. So there are 3 divine persons in that specific sense. And they're homoousios in that way that they share this nature by exemplifying this divinity universal. Monotheism for me, so this is T4. Specifically, I ground monotheism on the Father. I take the Father to be the one God, so he's numerically identical to the one God. So Trinitarianism, in my specific view of it, is monotheistic because we affirm the existence of the Father, who is the one God. And then the processions, the way I take it to be, is that the Father grounds the existence of the Son and the Spirit. I take grounding, and I think we're sort of going to unpack this later, but just sort of to briefly introduce it, I'll take it to be a specific relation that is analogous to causation. So I can affirm T5. I'm happy to say that the Father causes the Son and the Spirit, but I'll say that's in an analogical sense, specifically because the relation that ties them together is a grounding relation. So I'm happy with all these things here, but maybe I'll interpret them in specifically different ways from others, but I'm happy to affirm T1 to T5.
Right. And Ryan, how do you take or understand the persons in the Trinity?
So I'm very sympathetic to Josh's view. I just don't think it's really that modern. I think the idea that a person is a center of consciousness with free will, I think it's actually quite ancient and quite global. So I want to say, yeah, Josh's view of what a person is great, but it's not modern. We don't need to say that's modern. Just because a few theologians say that's a modern view, I'm like, no, they don't know what they're talking about. So yeah, person, center of consciousness with thought, feeling, action. They've got their own unique first-person perspective, just like Josh said. And since we're talking about a trinity, of so 3 persons, 3 centers of consciousness, each with their own free will. That's the idea.
Right. I think that's a great starting place because you guys are pretty much in agreement there. Now, moving on to the next issue, let's take a look at the homoousios doctrine. Now, Ryan, you've articulated something that you call minimal homoousios doctrine. Tell us what that is.
So the minimal homoousios doctrine is my attempt to just kind of lay out some of the basic constraints of what it means for the persons to have the same divine nature. This minimal homoousios doesn't really tell you exactly how the persons share the same divine nature, nor does it tell you how you get monotheism. What it does tell you is that is what the divine nature is and which properties are required for a person to have in order to be divine. So I'll just kind of state what the doctrine is and then I'll unpack it a bit. So minimal homoousios, as I've defined it in some different publications, is this: the 3 divine persons have all of the intrinsic great-making properties or perfections. And so that's the claim. Now it needs to be unpacked. So I take the concept of God to be that of a perfect being, which is the ultimate foundation of reality. And then a model of God is a particular conception of God that takes that basic concept, and it fills out the details of what it means to be perfect, and then what it means to be the ultimate foundation of reality. And so what it means to be perfect is to be the greatest possible being. And so everybody typically wants to say God's the greatest. Now, in order to be the greatest, you have to have all of the great-making properties or all of the perfections. So these are attributes that make a being intrinsically great. And these are attributes that, the way it's typically said, they're attributes that are better to have than not have. And so when I say that God is the greatest, what I mean is that God has all of the great-making properties, as his greatness extends to all possible perfections. And so then here's ultimately, I guess, how I see things. So if a Christian wants to say that all 3 of the persons are equally and fully divine, then this is what a Christian is going to need to say. All 3 of the persons have all of the great-making properties. If any of the divine persons lacks a great-making property, then that person is not fully divine and thus cannot have the same nature as God.
Right. So, Josh, I guess we'll turn it to you now. And what or how do you understand the homoousios doctrine?
Yeah, I'm happy to affirm again Ryan's conception of it. I think in my paper, this was the building paper, I think, I did affirm something like that. So I'm happy to affirm that understanding of the homoousios. But I would just go on to say, this was on the other monarchical paper, I'll try and state how they are homoousios. And that's by what I was saying before, that they exemplify this one divinity universal. And so I take sort of an exemplification relation to be a relation that ties these persons to the universal, but in a specific way. So it can be either directly or indirectly. It's indirectly if each of the persons exemplify this specific universal by being an instance of the kind deity, which is then characterized by this specific universal. And they can exemplify this specific universal directly if they are characterized by a mode. So a mode is just a particularized property. And so they are characterized by a mode, which is then an instance of this specific universal. So the key thing here is just that they're tied to this universal equally. And it's the same universal. So it's not like they have different divinity universals. There's one universal divinity, and they are each equally connected to in a way by an exemplification relation. So yeah, so the minimal homoousios doctrine that Ryan put forward, I affirm it, and I'm happy just to sort of flesh it out in this specific way with this exemplification relation.
Okay, that's great. I mean, you guys are agreeing so much.
It's too much agreement. Get on
yeah, yeah. People are watching. They're like, "What are we doing here, guys?" But yeah, no, it's good. It's good to understand each other on a base level and then see where the disagreements actually are. But moving forward, I think next step we want to take a look at is monotheism. So Ryan, let's start off with you. How do you understand monotheism?
So I would say that monotheism is just the claim that there's just one God. But what I take the one God to be is to be a triune being. So I'm going to be rejecting the monarchy of the Father as Josh understands it. I'm going to be saying the foundation reality, that perfect being, just is the Trinity.
Right. And how about you, Josh? How are you going to
Yeah,
understand
so I think
monotheism?
this is the first line of disagreement. So yeah, key thing for me is monotheism. Exactly, the base level is just the claim that there's one God. But then I identify this specific claim as that there is one fundamental divine personal deity. And so for me, specifically in the Trinity, there is only one fundamental divine person who's the Father. And so monotheism is grounded upon the Father. We believe that there is one God because there is one Father who is the fundamental divine personal deity. And I think for me, this is the historically grounded position that we find in Scripture. And then we also find carried on throughout church history, specifically expressed by Nicaea and then at Constantinople, where it says we believe in one God, the Father, and it identifies the one God as the Father. So for me, that is the key sort of distinction that I saw sort of when I was doing my research, that I really believe monotheism is predicated upon the Father and the Father alone. So I do reject this idea of there being a tripersonal God. I believe there's only a God who is one person, who's the Father.
Right. So, Ryan, unless you have any comments on that before we move to the next point. No, right? Okay.
No.
Can I jump in there? Just not to throw things,
sure.
But just a line of reasoning for that as well. So a reason maybe in my mind, that I would reject the tripersonal God is because for me, the key distinction that we can make between something that's God in this specific sense of the word is because this being is ultimate, and I use the term fundamental. But I believe an entity can only be fundamental if it is ungrounded. So I sort of cash this out in my paper by sort of Karen Bennett and Jonathan Schaefer, that a being is fundamental or an entity is fundamental if it is ungrounded and it is the ground of everything else. Now, my problem is if you identify the one God as the Trinity, then you have to go and say that the Trinity is ungrounded. Now, my problem is I don't think that's the case. I do believe the Trinity is grounded in its parts. It depends, obviously, how you conceptualize the Trinity. But if you have sort of, let's say, a part-whole relation between the persons and the Trinity, then you have to say in a way that the Trinity seems to be grounded upon something. And so then I'll have a problem to say, then how can that entity, the Trinity, be fundamental? Because it doesn't fulfill the condition of being ungrounded. And so for me, only the Father is the only thing within the Trinitarian framework who is ungrounded. There's nothing else that's ungrounded outside of the Father. The Son is grounded by the Father, and the Spirit is grounded by the Father. And if you affirm the Filioque, the Son as well. And then also the Trinity is grounded in the persons. And so for me, there is only one entity who can be classed as fundamental and thus be the one God, if you take the one God to be that of being a fundamental thing. So that's sort of just a reasoning that I'll give for my position here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I guess we'll move on to the next issue here, which is, I mentioned earlier, actually, that I had Ryan on previously. And like I said, the link is in the description of this video where he talked about the doctrine of divine processions. And in that video, he offered some reasons for rejecting that doctrine and why he thinks we should question it. So today we want to get into a discussion over this particular issue, which is this understanding that the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, all of what that means, and why Josh and Ryan disagree on that. So on that point, Ryan, why don't you tell us how the Nicene Creed understands the doctrine of divine processions?
Mm-hmm. So like you said in the previous interview, what I claimed was the Nicene Creed says that the Father causes the Son and the Holy Spirit to exist. And so we translate this into English as saying that the Son is begotten and not made, but both of those concepts are causal concepts. So the Son is begotten means that the Father eternally causes the Son to eternally exist, whereas something is made if it is caused to exist and it begins to exist. So that causal claim is what's going on in the Creed, and it's endorsed throughout like the majority of church history. And this causal claim is the source of various objections to the Trinity. And this causal claim is also something that like a number of Protestant theologians have rejected over the last century or so because they find it unbiblical, and they think it causes like a lot of different problems for the Trinity. And then in more recent years, various people have tried to fix the doctrine of processions by rejecting the causal claims of Nicaea and introducing like some other kind of dependency relation between the Father and Son. And so like, for example, like grounding relation, which Josh is going to say is like, earlier you mentioned you could think it's analogous to the causal relation. Yeah. So we're going to be doing that, discussing that in a lot of detail today.
Right. So now before we get into the grounding relation from Josh and him explaining everything in relation to that, Ryan, could you just give us a quick rundown, quick argument against the doctrine of divine processions?
Yeah. So in some different writings, I've called this the Eunomian argument because it's inspired by this early church thinker named Eunomius. And so it can kind of go a bit like this. First, let me define the doctrine or the attribute of aseity, which I take to be a great-making property, and then I can kind of run the argument. So here's how I've defined aseity in the past. So I say a being exists ase if and only if its existence is not dependent upon nor derived from something external. So that's aseity. And aseity, I think, has a really good fit with the claim that God is the foundation of reality. So Lindsay Cleveland, she has this claim that that when you look at the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, they all want to say that aseity is this great-making property because they want to claim that God is the foundation of reality. And the idea is that nothing that is dependent upon something else for its existence can be the foundation of reality. And then one kind of dependence relation is causation. So nothing that is caused to exist can be the foundation of reality. And so here's the argument. There's 7 premises. So premise number 1, to be divine is to have all of the great-making properties. Premise 2, anything that lacks a great-making property is not divine. Premise 3, aseity is a great-making property. And then premise 4, anything that has a cause for its existence does not have the property of aseity. Premise 5, the Son is caused to exist by the Father. That's just the doctrine of processions. And so then we get these 2 conclusions. So premise 6, thus the Son does not have the property of aseity. And then premise 7, thus the Son is not divine. So that's the argument.
Right. Now, Josh, we want to turn to you because you've responded to an objection like this from Ryan, I think, in some of your papers. And you rejected the claim that the Father causes the Son to exist, but you don't want to get completely rid of the notion of processions like Ryan does. You want to maintain some level of understanding that. Now, you offer a version of the divine processions in terms of a grounding relation. And because, this is a bit technical, we'd like for you to explain to the audience about this grounding relation and how it helps avoid the Eunomian argument that Ryan has just presented.
Yes. Grounding is a little bit of a technical notion, but it's very popular at the moment in contemporary metaphysics. So you have a lot of philosophers who are working on trying to sort of hash out the nature of this specific relation. The way I sort of conceptualize this expression or relation is according to Jonathan Schaeffer's interpretation of it, which is that of a directed dependence relation that connects the more fundamental entities to the less fundamental entities in the hierarchical structure of reality. So grounding is this sort of relation, means connecting these entities within this layered structure of reality that we have. And grounding is directed in a specific sense because it's governed by certain formal principles. So there's certain attributes of this relation that grounding has. So one of them is irreflexivity. So for example, let's say you have a given X, no X grounds itself. So this relation is irreflexive. It's asymmetrical. So if you have, let's say, X grounding Y, then Y does not also ground X. So it's asymmetric. It's also transitive. So if you have, let's say, X grounding Y and Y grounding Z, then X also grounds Z as well. And it's a necessitation relation. So if X grounds Y, then X necessitates Y. And so this sort of relation, given these formal principles, is one then that induces a partial order over the entities within its domain. And so I felt that this relation is very helpful in sort of trying to get out what I believe the pro-Niceans were trying to say when they were putting forward this doctrine of the processional relations. Because as Ryan sort of brought out in previous discussions with yourself, causation, or the causation relation that we understand it to be in contemporary metaphysics and physics and other things, seems to be problematic, because it's a lot of philosophers will take it to be a relation that's diachronic. And so it seems to be problematic because you don't want to have a diachronic relation that connects the persons of the Trinity. But what you have at grounding is that grounding is a synchronic relation. So it grounds things at a specific time. But then also it allows this fundamentality sort of thing to be in play as well. So the more fundamental entities, as I said before, are connected to the less fundamental entities by this specific relation. And so the Father, being the fundamental divine person within the Trinity, grounds the Son and the Spirit. And so he is more fundamental than them. That doesn't mean then that they don't share the same nature. They don't exemplify the same universal of divinity, because I am trying to say they do. But they are also, there is a fundamentality distinction between them because of this specific relation. But then lastly, this relation is also analogous to causation. So it doesn't have to be that we have to do away with causal language. We can still use the language of causation, but at a specific level, we'll say, well, it is not causation as we understand it to be, as this causal relation, but it's a grounding relation. But it is analogous to causation because it shares similar attributes to causation. The way that causation connects entities over time, grounding connects entities across levels. And so the way that causation is generative in a specific sense, grounding is as well. And you can also hash out grounding relations in sort of a structural equation modeling sort of format, which a lot of philosophers are using to try and hash out causation. And so you can do loads of things that you do with causation with grounding. So I felt that grounding is a specific relation that captures the heart of this specific doctrine. And I felt it was very useful to bring it into play in this specific context.
Right. Now, in response to that, Ryan, and in light of reading Josh's paper on this, do you think that the grounding relation helps maintain something like the doctrine of divine processions? And do you think that this grounding relation is consistent with the Son being fully divine?
I don't think it's going to help much. So like as I said before, a being exists au se if and only if its existence is not dependent upon nor derived from anything external. And so that should rule out any kind of dependency relation from God's existence. So like grounding is an asymmetric dependency relation. And in fact, it's also called an ontological dependency relation. And so it seems odd to me that like one would try to avoid the charge of ontological subordination by claiming that the Son is going to be ontologically dependent upon the Father. And so what this does is it really allows me to reformulate the eunomian argument. So we could call this one the revenge of the eunomian argument. And so here's how it goes. So again, it's going to have 7 premises. So number 1, to be divine is to have all the great-making properties. Number 2, anything that lacks a great-making property is not divine. Number 3, aseity is great-making property. Number 4, anything that has a ground for its existence does not have the property of aseity. And that would be because it's dependent upon something outside of itself. 5, the Son has a ground for his existence. 6, thus the Son does not have the property of aseity. And then 7, thus the Son is not divine. So it seems like we're going to get the same conclusion.
Right. So that's kind of a further argument that Ryan is putting back to you, Josh. Now, in one of your papers, you address an argument somewhat like this, and you claim that one can deny that aseity is a great making property. How would you justify denying that aseity is a great making property?
Yeah, so specifically in this eunomian argument, or the revenge of the eunomian argument, I take sort of problems with premise 3. Yes, I just don't see aseity to be a great making property. Reason being is because I just don't believe it's an intrinsic property. And as Ryan was saying before, and he said in his works as well, and I think the majority of people who agree with him, that great making properties are the intrinsic properties of these divine persons. And because aseity is not an intrinsic property, it can't then be classed as a great making property. Now, it'll be helpful to sort of define what I mean by an intrinsic property to see how then aseity, in my mind, can't be classed as one. So an intrinsic property is simply one that is independent of accompaniment. That is, and this was sort of brought out in my paper, that something is independent of accompaniment if it fulfills 4 conditions. So I'll just run through these conditions. So A, it is possible for a lonely object to possess P. So P is a property. B, it is possible for a lonely object to lack P. C, it is possible for an accompanied object to possess P. And then D, it is possible for an accompanied object to lack P. Now, aseity cannot be an intrinsic property as it fails to meet condition B, as it's not possible for a lonely object to be non-ase, which is that of its existence being dependent upon or derivative from an external object. So as aseity is not an intrinsic property, it cannot be classed as a great making property, as I said, because great making properties are intrinsic properties. And so if that is the case, premise 3 of this argument is false, and so the argument is unsound. Now, just to sort of further define terms that we use in those conditions, a lonely object is just an entity that exists in a world by itself. So there's nothing else existing in that world with it. And so when you have these conditions, it's saying this property that we are claiming to be intrinsic can be had by an object that has nothing existing with it. But then it can also be lacked by that object. And that means that the object just has the converse of that property. But then it can also be had if there is something existing in that world with that object, and then it can also be lacked if there is something else existing with that object. And so it's basically trying to say at the most ground level that if a property is intrinsic, it shouldn't be dependent upon anything in that world with that object. It doesn't matter how the world is like and the surroundings of that object. The property can be had or lacked given that there is something or there isn't something in the world with that entity. And so what I'm trying to say to you is that aseity doesn't fulfill one of those conditions, because you cannot lack aseity and be a lonely object, because that will mean that you are dependent upon something else. But you cannot be dependent upon something else if there is nothing else existing in that specific world in which you are residing within. And so that means then, if that's the case, then aseity does not fulfill this condition. And these conditions are taken to be necessary conditions. They aren't sufficient conditions, but they are taken to be necessary conditions for intrinsicality by the majority of philosophers who are working on this issue. So as long as a property cannot fulfill these conditions, I think the majority of philosophers will say you just have to take that property to be extrinsic and not intrinsic.
All right. And I apologize, I had to shut my camera off for 1 second. But what do you guys, going back to Ryan now, what do you make of this strategy that Josh has just employed? Do you think that aseity is really an extrinsic property, or is it something else? How do you understand this?
Yeah, when I was reading Josh's paper, I found this really surprising. It took me a while to think through it. So I guess at the end of the day, I want to say it's not going to help too much. It's because of condition B. I think condition B, which is the claim that it's possible to be alone and lack a particular property. That's condition B, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, good. I want to make sure I was getting that right. Yeah. So I think that condition is inconsistent with the very idea of essential intrinsic properties. So like essential properties are properties that a being cannot exist without. Like essential properties are typically said to be intrinsic to their bearers. And so all cases of essential properties are going to fail to satisfy condition B because it's impossible for a lonely object to lack its essential properties. So this independence criterion, I think, it's going to fail to capture what it is to be an intrinsic property, and thus give us no reason for thinking that aseity is an extrinsic property. And so let me give you like an illustration of this. So consider all of God's essential great-making properties. So great-making properties are intrinsic properties, and then take any essential great-making property you like from the divine nature. Every single one of them is gonna fail to satisfy condition B. So, God's maximal power. Is it possible for God to exist alone and lack maximal power? Well, no. Well, what about God's maximal goodness? Is it possible for God to exist alone and lack maximal goodness? No. Well, consider God's necessary existence. Is it possible for God to exist alone and lack necessary existence? No. What about God's free will or his perfect rationality? Is it possible for God to exist alone and lack free will or perfect rationality? No. And I think you can go one by one through every single essential great-making property, and you can do this exact same analysis. And should we infer from all of this that all of God's essential great-making properties are extrinsic? I think the answer is going to be no. I think it's going to be really implausible. But condition B is going to force us to the conclusion that all of these really obvious great-making properties are extrinsic. Hence, I'm going to just say condition B just cannot be a condition for intrinsicality, since it rules out the very possibility of essential intrinsic properties.
Right. Now, Josh, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Ryan just said. So what do you have to say in response to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think there's a bit of a problem here, just in sort of conceptions and understanding certain things. Firstly, I think there's a misunderstanding of the nature of an essential property. An essential property is one that an entity must have in order to be that entity. However, that doesn't mean that an essential property must be intrinsic, as you can have essential extrinsic properties. So, for example, if we just take a normal case, if you take the property that Socrates has of being the son of Sophronicus, or however you call his dad, I always struggled with his name.
I don't know.
Let's go with Sophronicus. So let's say Socrates has the property of being the son of Sophronicus. That is an essential property of Socrates. He must have it in order to be Socrates. However, this property is extrinsic, as it's not independent of accompaniment. Specifically, it fails to meet condition A of the independence criteria. And so condition A is just the condition that says it is possible for a lonely object to possess P, as it's not possible for a lonely Socrates to possess the property of being the son of Sophronicus. He cannot be alone and be the son of Sophronicus. Sophronicus had to existed for him to be the son of Sophronicus. And so there cannot be a lonely world where he exists with and has that property. And so that means then that he has an essential extrinsic property. And so that means that an entity can have essential extrinsic properties. And so the objection, I would say, at the first hand doesn't work, as God can essentially have his properties, yet some of these essential properties would be intrinsic and some of them would be extrinsic. But also, more importantly, I also believe that there's a misunderstanding about the focus of the criteria. The criteria focuses on providing a necessary condition for the intrinsicality of property types and not property tokens. That is, I believe there's sort of been a muddling of the type and token distinction. A type is just a category of property, and a token is just a particular instance of that property. And so one must distinguish between property types from tokens and insist that the necessary condition on intrinsicality only applies to property types. And so just to make this more plain, because this can get all abstract when you get sort of into philosophical concepts. So let's say the property of being kind-hearted. Okay, so the property of being kind-hearted is an intrinsic property, and that seems quite plausible that the property of being kind-hearted is intrinsic to its bearer. So let's say we suppose that Jesus is kind-hearted. One may think that it's essential to him that he is kind-hearted. It is what Jesus is to be kind-hearted. He couldn't be a mean person and be Jesus in our understanding of who Jesus was. And so what you'll have then is this bringing out the case that condition B is trying to talk about property types. Because what we will see here, specifically just going away from this example, is that if you look at condition B, it says that it's possible for a lonely object to lack kind-heartedness. And so the quantification of a lonely object makes it clear that the condition is met if it is possible for some object or another to be both lonely and lacking in kind-heartedness. And this surely is the case. I mean, even if Jesus is essentially kind-hearted, some human, let's say like me, I hope I am sometimes, but like me, could exist without anything else and be very bitter and non-kind-hearted, and so lack this specific property. So what I'm trying to say here is that at the general level, you need to look at this condition and these conditions together as applying to types and not so much instances. And so even though Jesus might instantiate this property in an intrinsic fashion, and it's an essential thing to him as well, that doesn't necessarily mean everything within the category of, let's say, a person or an object who instantiates kind-heartedness does this in an intrinsic way. And so we're looking specifically at property types. And so if we then apply this to Dr. Mullins' sort of examples, so let's say, consider, let's say the property of maximal power, so omnipotence. While God could not exist without having maximal power, let's say we look at another example of an entity, a pebble. A pebble could be lonely and lack maximal power. Or if you consider the property of perfect rationality, all non-divine beings lack this perfection, and they would exist, accompanied or not, without this perfection. And so what we then have is the case that these conditions, A, B, C, and D, are applicable in certain ways, but you also always have to say that even though God, let's say, has this in an essential way, it doesn't necessarily mean he has to have this in an intrinsic way. Because the property, let's say we're going with arseity, the property of arseity as a property type is one that is extrinsic. And so what I think that you're sort of, I would say there's a confusion here, and please do correct me, is that you're saying just because it's essential to God, he must have this in an intrinsic way. I'm trying to say to you, it's essential to God, but he has this in an extrinsic way, given that arseity is a property which is had in an intrinsic fashion as a property type. Omnipotence is not that. Omnipotence is an intrinsic property, or power in the general sense is an intrinsic property of every bearer. So God and every entity has power in an intrinsic way. Arseity is not one of those properties. Knowledge is a property that an entity has in an intrinsic fashion. But again, I would say arseity is not. And so you will have to just go and look at God's properties and a list of his properties and say some of them are intrinsic, some of them are extrinsic. And we are using this specific criterion in a way that applies to the type of properties and not so much to the instances of those properties. I don't know if I was clear in bringing that out, but it's just trying to say some of God's properties are going to be extrinsic, some of them are going to be intrinsic, all of them are going to be essential to him if we're talking about omnipotence, omniscience, and all those sort of things. But I would say to you, arseity as a property type, born by anyone, is done in an extrinsic fashion, even though omnipotence and the ones that you listed are ones that are born in an intrinsic fashion by God and any other entity that could have them.
Right. Now, I know that Ryan is eager to respond here, but I'm trying to follow along with the chat, and I think a lot of people are a bit confused and lost. So let me see if I could bring this down to a ground level, because this question here from John Lee is saying, are both arguing that the Son does not have a aseity? No. So let me just characterize the basic disagreement at this point, and then you guys can tell me if you agree or not. So, and also there was a question earlier about, there was some confusion that people thought that Ryan didn't think that the Son is divine. And that's not correct. So both of these guys are Trinitarian Christians. They both believe that the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all divine. The fundamental disagreement that I see, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, is what it actually means to be divine. So there's this question over this property that's called aseity. And Ryan is saying that it's necessary to have this property in order to be considered divine. And Josh is disagreeing with that. And now we're having a discussion over what sort of property aseity is. Is it intrinsic? Is it extrinsic? And what the relevant, difference is. That's kind of where we're at now, as far as I understand it. Are you guys happy with that characterization?
It seems close enough. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people in the chat are kind of confused. But Ryan, I want to give you a chance to come back on what Josh just had to say there. So what would you respond to that?
I think I'm a bit confused too, so I'm trying to work this out. So one of the starting claims is to be a great making property, it's got to be intrinsic. And so then the response is to go, well, I've got a story to tell you about why aseity is not an intrinsic property, so it can't be a great making property. So this argument doesn't work, right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Now, and so I'm confused about what condition B is really all about now. So originally I thought it was just, can this being, whatever this being is, can it lack aseity if it's all alone or if it's accompanied? If it can lack it, if it's alone, then it's going to be extrinsic. And then I was like, well, but if it's an essential property, well, then it can't lack that property. Well, but now you're saying like, well, actually, is it just possible for any kind of being whatsoever to lack whatever this property is? And if that's possible, well, then it's going to be extrinsic. Is it my understanding that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then I can do the same thing again with all of God's essential properties. I could go omnipotence. Is it possible for any being to lack that? Well, yeah, of course, because you give the rock example. Is it possible for any possible being to lack perfect rationality? Well, yeah, of course, because a rock's not perfectly rational. And so I can just go down the list again, and then I feel like I'm right back to, it looks like all of God's essential properties are extrinsic, and in which case they're not perfect. They're not like intrinsic, and then they're not going to be great making. And yeah.
Just clarification of that. So if a entity can lack that specific property, and let's say it's lonely or accompanied, and it can possess it, be lonely or accompanied, then that property is intrinsic. So it's saying that if it can lack it and if it can possess it, accompanied or lonely, then it is intrinsic. But if it cannot do that, one of those conditions aren't met for that property, then it's extrinsic. Now, so let's just say we focus on omnipotence, for example. Omnipotence, or let's say property type, and we say power instead of the instance that God has of it. So let's say power. So let's say we run through, and so I'll just read through it. So the 4 conditions, and I'll just replace P with power. So it's possible for a lonely object to possess power. It's possible for a lonely object to lack power. It's possible for an accompanied object to possess power. And it's possible for an accompanied object to lack power. Now, it seems to be the case that that could be met for each of those conditions. An entity can have power, it can lack power, and so be weak, and be accompanied or not. And so if that's the case, then power is an intrinsic property of that entity. But what I'm saying then, and you can do this for goodness. I mean, you can replace P and put goodness, and you'll have the same thing. All the conditions are met for goodness. An entity can be alone or accompanied and lack or possess goodness. But that cannot be the case for aseity. Because what you will have is that it's possible for a lonely object to possess aseity, which seems to be the case. You can be lonely and be aseity. But is it possible for a lonely object to lack aseity? That means to be dependent, to be non-aseity. Well, that's not the case. It cannot be non-aseity and be lonely, because if it's non-aseity, then it must be dependent upon something else. And so you cannot have a lonely object that's dependent. You just can't have that. And so what that is then saying is, because one of these conditions is not met, then that specific property of being independent, which we'll define aseity as, is not one which can be classed as intrinsic, even though power, goodness, knowledge, all those sort of things can be had. Because it's just simply the case that me being dependent, so me having the converse of aseity, is something that requires something else. Something else in my surroundings has to be there in order for me to have this non-aseity property. And so that means then, because the property of aseity is contingent in a way on my surroundings, me possessing or lacking it is dependent upon something within my surroundings, I cannot have that then in an intrinsic fashion. But power is not like that. Power is something that you can have, you can lack, you can have it accompanied or lack it accompanied. It doesn't matter what your surroundings like. You can have the converse and be accompanied or lonely. And so it's just basically saying it seems to be the case, even intuitively, that power is just a thing that an entity has independent of its surroundings. But aseity is not. Aseity seems to be something which an entity has dependent upon its surroundings, because me lacking that property is going to be contingent upon my surroundings. If I don't have something in my surroundings, then I cannot lack that property. I cannot be dependent if I don't have something in my surroundings. So it seems to be that there is some relation to the outside of that entity, which is not had for power, goodness, and knowledge. And so then I'll just say those types of properties are possessed in intrinsic fashion by an entity, but aseity isn't, because it doesn't fulfill this specific condition.
Right. So at this point, since we're kind of done with the outline, I guess we're just going to have some healthy back and forth. I don't know if you want to respond to that as well, Ryan.
Yeah, I wanted, I guess, a bit, because I'm still really kind of confused. So the claim that God's all say, meaning like no dependence, whatsoever. If God's alone, so you take creation ex nihilo, which says that there really is this prior state of affairs where God exists all alone, and then God exists with all this stuff after He creates stuff. Well, God is an independent being prior, all alone, and an independent being subsequent, like when He exists with all the creation stuff. And of course, like God couldn't be dependent in any way, shape, or form with stuff or without stuff. I guess I'm still like, there's something I'm missing here. I feel like I'm just confused of like what the exact difference is between like power, knowledge, goodness, rationality, whatever, and being an independent being. Because it seems like all of those, of course, like if you have that, then you couldn't lack it being lonely or accompanied or whatever. Like so I'm still missing exactly the difference between aseity and the rest of the attributes that really makes aseity switch over to the extrinsic. Like I don't know. I just feel like I'm confused. I'm missing something.
Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I'm just not being clear in explaining it. Yeah. It's just really just trying to say, let's just look at the time. Let's just for let's say, for example, just pause on God and just say we're just looking at this property of power that can be instantiated or exemplified by an entity. Now, let's say we just take a possible world and we have a possible world that's filled with things. Now, that property of power that's had by that entity, can it also be possessed or lacked by that entity in that possible world? Well, it seems to be the case. It can. I mean, I can be weak and be accompanied, or be weak and be lonely. So it just seems to be the case that doesn't matter what surroundings you place me in, my possession or lacking of that specific property is not going to be affected by my surroundings. But let's say we just take a possible world. And so this is not saying, this is actually what happened. So I'm just going to remove myself from, let's say, the narrative of creation ex nihilo and just say a possible world. Can this also be said for aseity by a specific entity? Well, it can't be, because just the lacking of that property is going to be dependent upon something else in that specific world that entity is existing in. And so it just seems to be the case that I can only lack that property and so have the converse of that property if I am accompanied. But I can't be in a possible world where I'm not ase and there is nothing else existing in that possible world. And so it just seems to be that type of property itself seems to be contingent or dependent upon the world that I'm existing in. My possession or lacking of it is going to be dependent on how my surroundings are like. And so people like David Lewis and others who've sort of looked at this are just trying to say at an intuitive level, an intrinsic property is just one that an entity has in and of itself. And it also can not lose, because that would be weird with God because it's essential property, but it can lack this specific property in and of itself. If I have it or I possess it, it's just dependent upon me and nothing else outside of me. But is that also said about aseity? well, it doesn't seem to be the case, because my possession of it can be just had by myself. But if I was to lack that property, it's going to be dependent upon the surroundings that I am in. If I'm accompanied, I can lack it. If I'm lonely, I can't. And so if we then, as I was saying before, if we just list all of the properties of God, it just seems to be the case that this is going to actually be the same for some other properties. So, for example, him being the creator, that seems to be, and this seems to be an extrinsic property, seems to be a property that God's going to have dependent upon his surroundings. And that's going to be because one of these specific things are going to be missing. And actually, I think if just off the, let's say we're just running off the top of my head, it'll probably be condition A. It's possible for a lonely object to possess that property. So it doesn't seem that if God was alone and there was nothing else existing in that specific world that he's existing within, that he could possess the property of being the creator, let's say, of the universe or something. So it seems to be that condition A would not be met. And that's why then creation, or being the creator, is an extrinsic property, because of that specific condition. And you could go through, certain other properties and you'll see the same thing. But if you were to go through, let's say, eternality, let's say goodness, let's say power, let's say knowledge, it just seems to be the case that all of these conditions would actually be met. And that will be the specific reason why then these properties are intrinsic and him being the creator isn't. And this, I'm trying to say, is that we should also place our deity within that category of creator. Seems to be something which doesn't meet these conditions, and so then cannot be classed as intrinsic. It must be taken to be extrinsic. Don't know if I was any clearer. I do apologize if I wasn't. But it's just a lot. Yeah.
No, of course it is. Yeah, I guess I got one final question on this, because I don't want to bore the audience with because I know they got other questions they want to get to. So let's say that aseity is extrinsic, and so the Father is ungrounded, because that's part of what it means to be ase, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible in any possible world? Could it be the case that the Father lacks that property of being ungrounded?
Could he lack that property? No.
Yeah.
No, I don't think he could. Just because I think it's an essential property of him. So to be the Father is to be the ungrounded divine person. And so if he was grounded, then he wouldn't be the Father. It wouldn't be part of his real definition. And so that's problematic. So I'll say it's an essential property of him.
Yeah.
And so he couldn't lack it in another possible world.
And is that going to be extrinsic? Because part of what it means to be ase is to, not have dependency, and ungrounded is a dependency. So that seems like just a specification of part of aseity. So is ungrounded going to be so that's all? I'm sorry. Let me restate the question. Yeah. So ungrounded is going to be an extrinsic property of the Father.
Yes. I'll take that to be an extrinsic. Yeah, I'll just take it to be essential extrinsic property of him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's weird. Okay, it's interesting. Okay. All right. There you go.
Okay. Thanks.
I think that people, if they don't really understand the back and forth, this is a really important point of disagreement, because I think a lot hinges on it, on Josh's conception of aseity being an extrinsic property of the Father. It's really a fundamental difference. So they're not just kind of bloviating back and forth. I don't want people to think that. Yeah, it's a real substantive difference in the discussion. So I don't want people to think that way. But yeah, I don't know if you want to move on to a further issue here, Ryan, if you have another question.
Yeah, I'm happy to move on. I mean, I don't know, Josh, if you're...
Yeah.
Okay. So go for it. What do you have? What else do you guys have?
So I had a question about, so part of the motivation for this grounding relation and for the monarchy of the Father was that, so you take the claim. So my claim was that when I say God, I'm just referring to the triune being. And you had said that the Trinity is going to be then grounded in its parts, and so it wouldn't be fundamental. I guess I would reject that claim, because I would want to say that the Trinity doesn't have parts, because I take parts to be things that are detachable. And I don't think the divine persons could possibly exist apart from each other, so they're not detachable. So I don't think the persons would be parts. So then I guess I kind of would lose my understanding what the motivation would be to affirm the monarchy of the Father, just with this one issue. I know there's other justifications you have, but at least with regards to that one issue. And so I was curious what Joshua we had to say about that.
Yeah, I would sort of two things on this issue. I would probably take for myself just a part to be a portion of an entity that's numerically distinct from it. So I probably won't myself add the detachable element to that. But I'm obviously happy to disagree about that point and be corrected. But I would just say it's numerically distinct. And so given that they are just numerically distinct, it's possible for them to be grounded. Them to be grounding the Trinity. But then also the second thing I'll take it then, it would just be, it depends then what you take the ontological sort of status of the Trinity to be and what the nature of the Trinity is. I mean, is it a group? Is it a set? Is it something? As long as these entities are numerically distinct from it, there will have to be some relation between them. Unless you take, let's say, you did sort of say it's not a compositional relation, but if you took something like composition as identity, you could then say, okay, maybe they're just identical to it, so there's no grounding relation between them. But as long as they are numerically distinct from it, I think there's going to be some relation there between them. I would personally want to take that to be a grounding relation, just because I think they are more fundamental than the Trinity. But I don't know if that works the other way around. I think the Trinity is what it is because of the persons. The Trinity is divine, can be classed as God, can do the things that it does because of the persons. But I don't think that works the other way around. I don't think the persons do what they do and are what they are because of the Trinity. And so I think there is a fundamentality relation there, that they are more fundamental than the Trinity. And so I think grounding is a thing that can cash that out. I think the Trinity exists in virtue of the persons and not vice versa. So I would personally take there to be a grounding relation there, but I'll be interested to understand what sort of the relation is between the Trinity and the persons. I don't know if you have a thought on that or.
Not a ton, because I just think like the Trinity, just like that's a reference term, like so to say, like I'm referring to this triune being, and of course, like I mean, I guess it's a trivial sense in which if there weren't three persons, then you wouldn't have a Trinity. But I don't take that like the Trinity to be like this other thing above and beyond, like the persons. Yeah, so I guess I don't have an interesting story to tell there. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Can I ask you a question right now?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Go for it.
Thinking myself. So because you reject the processional relations, how do you individuate the persons? So I'm quite interested to understand that. So how can you pick out within their kind?
Yeah, the fact that I've got three different thinking things, each with their own first-person perspectives, that just like already assumes individuation. And then I can give other things, but like all of them would just be assuming there's this individuation already. So if I've got three different first-person perspectives, then I would have three different sets of what are called de se beliefs, or like beliefs where I use the word I. So like, I am the Father, and the other one would be like, well, I'm the Son, and the other one would be like, well, I'm the Holy Spirit. I'm the one thinking this thought, and you're the one thinking that thought. So you'd have all these things. But again, that's all presupposing individuation, though, because I don't think there would need to be anything further to individuate them other than the fact that there are three centers of consciousness, and they each have their own free will. So, yeah.
Because my issue would be, I think, let's say prior to the incarnation, prior to creation, let's say they're living, they're existing in a lonely world. Mm-hmm. It's just them. I don't know how I could distinguish between them, because I think their knowledge will be type identical. They'll have the same content. If they're doing anything, they'll do the same things. And they don't have any relational distinction between them. So I think unless, as you were saying, the presupposition is already there that they are three, I don't know how someone could tell a story to distinguish them and stop them from being collapsed into one. I think it seems to be the case that everything, I know this would be assuming some principles that are controversial, let's say the identity of indiscernibles, but it seems to be the case that they would be indiscernible. And so I just don't know how then someone could pick them out. I think I can only understand how they can be picked out, given their relation to one another, which is distinct, but their relation to one another, I would only say, can be distinguished by some form of generation, as someone who affirms a doctrine to be. But I can't see what their relation distinction would be, because they're not spatial, they're not located in different places, and like I said, their knowledge would be type identical. So I just don't know how then you could pick them out without making that presupposition that they are already three.
Yeah, well, you can't have relations between things unless they're already individuated. So I don't think relations generate individuation, because you already have to have things that are individuated to stand in the relations. And then again, you'd have three different first-person perspectives. So you'd have one going, I love those guys over there, and I love myself. And the other ones would be like, yeah, I love myself, and then myself picks out this individual, and I love those guys over there. And the over there being, of course, like that'd be metaphorical over there, but psychically over there or something. So I guess I'm like, they would have a lot of the same kind of propositional content, but when it comes to de se beliefs, they're not going to have the same propositional content, because the I is going to uniquely pick out each individual. And then I guess I don't see why they would always have to be performing the same actions. So when it comes to, say, creation and the economy of salvation, one of them could be like, hey, which one of us should become incarnate? Do you want to do that? Oh, no, that would be horrible. I want to get nailed to a cross. I'm not doing that. Okay, what about you? Okay. I'll do that. Okay, you don't have to twist my arm too much. You've got these easy ways. Again, it's already presupposing that there are these distinct centers of consciousness, though, and they have unique de se beliefs. So, and they could perform different actions. Only one of them is going to be doing the incarnation stuff. Only one of them is going to do the whole indwelling stuff, and so on. They're performing different actions. They're all functioning together in their acts to achieve some overarching goal, but different acts.
Yeah.
I
don't know if it's fine to come back to you, but just on that point. But I was trying to say, let's say we have a possible world where they're lonely. So prior to them creating anything or doing anything outside, of loving each other, I don't know how you could pick them out. I could understand what you're saying about them having these de se beliefs and them thinking and doing things that are different when there's other things there, so they can react to those things in different ways. But let's say it's just them existing by themselves without anything else existing in that possible world. I just don't see how they are not indiscernible. I just think they would have the same beliefs about things, given that they are omniscient. So they will know that, the true value of each proposition, and that it will be the same. Maybe they're not even performing any actions. Let's say this is prior to them doing anything. They're just there. Don't know what they're doing, but they're just there. So I just can't pick out anything that will distinguish them.
Oh, how about this?
Yeah.
The Father could say, I know that I am not identical to the Son. The Son can't say that, because that would be incoherent. It'd be irrational if the Son said that. But the Son can say, I know that I am not identical to the Father. So they're going to have those different beliefs. Because, those couldn't be identical beliefs.
But what would be the truth maker of that proposition?
The fact that there's a one center of consciousness and a different center of consciousness. And they're not identical to each other. I mean, I guess I'm just not seeing what the problem is, really.
Yeah, I'm just seeing. I think there's a presupposition there that they're because what would give the grounds for them to have distinct consciousnesses? Like, what's the ground for that? So for example, let's say you're holding to the processional relations. The Son would just have the thought, oh, I was generated by the Father. The Father would have the thought, I was not generated by the Son. That's an easy way to distinguish them. And you could say, okay, they have distinct consciousnesses. But I don't know what the content of their beliefs would be that would enable them to ground the truth value of that statement. So the Father saying, I have a distinct consciousness from the Son. I don't think there's anything that would ground that, because they haven't done anything that's different. They have the same thoughts, same beliefs.
I'm saying they don't have the same thoughts.
Sorry?
I'm saying they don't have the same thoughts, though, because even if the Son is caused or is not caused, the Son's still going to be able to have the different thought of, I am not the Father. The causal relation doesn't change anything about that.
Yeah.
He's still going to have that belief. So I guess,
I'm just losing how there would be a truth maker for that statement. I just don't know what would.
You just need a thinking thing that has a true belief that I'm not the Father. and you got a thinking thing. And if you got Trinity, you got three thinking things.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe I'm just assuming that, like I was saying, controversial principle, identity of the discernibles. But I think for myself, it just seems to be that they would be indiscernible. Unless you hold to them having some aseity or something. Something like just, some individual essence or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy with that. I know not everybody is. And I know that's kind of crazy for me to say that. But yeah, no, I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Okay. My only problem with that then would be, what would be the propositions that are true of that specific essence that allows it to be particularized? Because an individual essence is particularized. You have general essences and individual essences, but the individual essence of an entity is the thing that enables them to be that entity. And so then what would be the propositions that are true of that specific essence that allows it to be individuated? So I think you get back to the same problem that, well, how can you say they have an individual essence? What grounds that?
Okay, because I'm taking
grounding. You might hear the word grounding.
Yeah, it's quite to be the case. Like, because I'm taking individuation to be primitive. I don't think individuation consists in anything. Because I think any sort of story you want to tell about what makes that thing individuated from that other thing already presupposes that they just are individuated. So yeah, I think, and maybe that's. Do you think maybe that's possibly the case? Where the disagreement is that I'm saying this is primitive.
Yeah, maybe that might be it, because I would just say, well, part of, for example, the individual essence of the Father, part of that real definition that expresses that would be him being uncaused.
Right.
So that would be the thing that individuates his essence, and so that's how we can pick him out of his kind or the kind deity. But I think obviously, if you then take it to be primitive, that would be then the way to solve that issue then.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Jake, were there any super chats that
not really. We got a lot of confusion. I want to address one point here.
It's always I think.
Yeah, John said Dr. Mullins said, "Thus the Son is not divine," and yeah, but it was part of an argument where he was trying to say that Josh's position actually results in that. Ryan thinks that the Son is divine. I mean, so I don't know why. I mean, I guess maybe people aren't paying close enough attention, but Ryan definitely believes the Son is divine. He simply was stating that as a premise in an argument, trying to use it against Josh's position. But yeah, no, there's not really any too many interesting questions in the chat. So, I mean, I'm happy to carry on if you guys want to continue going back and forth.
I don't know, Ryan, if you have a question. I've got one. I've saved up.
Go for it. Yeah, go for
it. Okay, so I'm interested to understand how your position, your view of the Trinity, can deal with the omnipotence problem. So there being three omnipotent entities. Just sort of my position that I would take is, given the processional relations, and there being a relational distinction between the persons, the Father being relationally superior to the Son and the Spirit, and that him being more fundamental than them, he has the ability and right to, so this is sort of developing Swinburne's position on this, he has the right to designate spheres of activity, and so there just won't be a clash of the wills of the persons. But the only way to be able to get that, in sort of my view, would be because of that relational distinction between them, because the Father being more fundamental than the persons, he has the right to do that. But I'll just be sort of interested to understand in your position how you can logically have three omnipotent persons without their volitions clashing.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think we need to set the argument up a bit better for the audience. So there's these common objections saying you can't have more than one omnipotent being. And sometimes that's an argument to say this is why monotheism is true, because only one omnipotent being could be possible. You do the same thing with infinity, you do the same thing with knowledge and omniscience and all these kind of stuff. So with omnipotence, that's one of the standard arguments is, imagine you got two omnipotent beings, and one of them call him Apollo, and the other one call him Zeus. And Apollo is like, ooh, there's this feather on the ground. I want to move it just an inch to the left. And then Zeus is like, no, screw you. I'm going to move it an inch to the right. And they both try to move the feather, but the feather doesn't go anywhere. And so it seems like their power just kind of cancels each other out. And so, well, maybe then that should give you some reason for thinking you can't have two omnipotent beings. Is that like is that the first stage
Yes.
of kind of the argument?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then Swinburne's view is to go, well, I got a story. What if one of them is in charge and says, like, you guys, the three of us were all omnipotent, but let's make sure we don't clash. But I'm going to be in charge of like what areas you over there are in charge of, and then the other person over there, I'm going to be in charge. I'm going to say you're in charge of these other things over here. So you're all in charge of like these different spheres of activity, and so there's no possibility for clash now, and that's supposed to kind of remove the problem.
Yeah.
I guess I don't see why. One, I guess I don't think the first stage of the argument really works, because the mere possibility of a clash wouldn't show that they both don't have omnipotence. It would just show that if they clash, they'd get nothing done. So that doesn't seem terribly interesting. Like, they could still have all of like the powers or abilities and none of the liabilities. And I think that's part of I think that's what it means to be a maximal in power. Just the ability, and just like having a clash, like it wouldn't undermine that. Further, say I could go a Swinburne kind of route, but not quite. I could just say, since the fact that all three of them are perfectly rational and perfectly good, if there were going to be a clash, they would be able to figure it out. They could be able to go, "Ooh, I want to do this. I want to do well, but we're perfectly good and loving. We could compromise a bit." Like it seems like very obvious. Like that is a possibility there if there really are fully rational and fully like perfectly good. I don't know.
Yes,
I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. My only issue would be, let's say it's about a non-moral issue, and like you were saying about the feather moving. I just don't see how they could possess the ability to, let's say, actualize any state of affairs or perform any logically possible action, and they can fail in that. Like, it just doesn't seem to be the case. If they have the intention there to do something, they can do it, and it doesn't fail. That's why I sort of see omnipotence sort of to imply. But then let's say there is that possible world in which, one of them is saying they want to do this, the other one's saying they want to do that, and there is no reason that saying one should, choose one over the other, then it just seems to be the case that there would be that volitional clash. So, I mean, if it's a moral issue, it seems to me that they could discuss it and say, you know what, come on, it seems to me this is the better option. Let's put it over here. And so let's say the father or the son could convince the other one to say, yeah, come on, come to my side because it makes sense. But if there is no sort of moral sort of value on it, and so when I say moral, I'm saying it just seems to be, good enough, good to go one side, good to go the other side. There's no reason, to move it to any side of the way. Then it seems to be the case that they wouldn't come to an agreement on it. Because there would not be any reason to come to that agreement. There would not be any reason to choose one over the other. But normally when let's say we have that everyday conversation, we come to an agreement on something because that option that we end up choosing seems to be the best option in that specific case. But it just doesn't seem to me that there would be that best option. I don't know what you do.
Yeah. Okay. Let me give you this will be a more of like a slight, hopefully it's a fun story. I don't know. Let's see. So imagine you've got like Newtonian space. So it's absolute space. It's an infinite set of locations. And so the father is like, I want to create the universe like at like this point in space. And the Holy Spirit's like, I want to create the universe just a little bit to the left. And then the son's like, actually, I want to create it a little bit further to the left. And all of these points in space, they're all equally good places to create the universe. But we got this disagreement here. And then now like, okay, is there a reason to prefer like creating the universe there, or there? Well, no, they're all good places. In that sort of situation, so now there's no moral considerations at play. They've got a moral consideration for creating a universe, maybe to like bring about more goodness, to bring about the value of like creature and creator love, loving relations or something. But like where to put the universe, well, that's not a moral consideration. So what are they going to do? And so they could have this clash. Would that set up kind of the problem close to like what you want? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, in those sort of situations, I would want to say a perfectly rational being always acts for a reason unless he has a reason not to. So in some cases, when you have, you've got like a really good goal, like a good reason to motivate a goal, but you've got something that would kind of like, you might have to make an arbitrary decision at some point in order to bring about that goal. So because if you don't do an arbitrary decision, your options become either I attain this goal of creating a universe, or my goal is completely frustrated. And so I think all three divine persons would see that, be like, okay, either we're going to have to come to an agreement that we create the universe somewhere, or we're not going to be able to satisfy our desire to create a universe. We've got moral reasons to create the universe. So we're going to have to make an arbitrary decision. And I would want to think that three perfectly rational beings could come to some kind of agreement of like, it doesn't really matter. Why don't we just create it like in that one spot way over there that none of us said? Is that a good compromise? Sure. Why not? Like that seems like they could figure that out. They could sort that out. I don't know.
Yeah. I can see that in that specific scenario, but
there might be others where
would that apply to all scenarios? Because it needs to apply. I mean, for them to have this property, it seems to be that in every case they should be able to come to that agreement. And so I would struggle to say that I could then think of, every case where it seems to be that they would just say, you know what, let's just do it that way. I would just seem, it seems all, I don't know if it's just my a priori sort of idea about it. It just seems to be the case that divine persons, they're not going to be having a coffee, every decision, what should we do? Come on, So it just seems to be that they would assist, there would be a system there. There would be a system that would determine how things are done. And I would just say that having that relational distinction between them is a way to establish that distinction, which I think the discussion sort of model would be problematic in applying to all cases, when it can maybe apply to some, but I don't know it would apply to all cases. And
Jacob, sorry.
Yeah, can I offer something? I don't know if Ryan's happy with this, but it's something I'm thinking of on the spot. Is there a possibility in which they could assign a leader, so to speak, and say, well, okay, the father, you're going to be the leader. So if we don't agree, but basically whatever you say goes type of thing, almost like a foreman on the job. What do you think of that?
I mean, that's basically kind of like the Swinburne style response. And I think that seems fine to me, because I would think that regardless of what you think about the Trinity, or if you're going to be like Unitarian, we're going to want to say when God creates a universe, he's going to have a plan ahead of time. And part of that plan is going to include certain policies of this is what I will do in situation X and situation Y and situation Z and so on. And so if you've got a Trinity, I think you're just kind of building that into that story of like, we should come up with a policy and a plan before we do anything. And, hey, you're going to be in charge for this part of the plan. You're going to be in charge for this part of the plan, and so on. So I think they would hash it out before they get into before they start creating into the world and be like, oh crap, what are we doing now? Like, I don't think they would, I think they would figure out a plan before that happens.
And Josh, you can have a comeback if you want. I just want to address, because somebody did post a super chat here. Question for Dr. Mullins. Would the Eunomian objection work against one-self Trinity theories? And he's mentioning Leftow as an example. I don't know if either one of you want to comment on that.
I've got thoughts, but do you want Josh to address
you can
before we do the question?
Sure, go ahead.
My problem is I think you'll still have the same problem that you have in them deciding amongst them how they should do something. You'll just have it in this specific case, because then you would say, well, what's the reason for choosing that one over the other one? There wouldn't be any reason to do that. But when you have the processional relations and you have this fundamentality structure within the Trinity, there is a clear reason there. The Son and Spirit come from the Father, they're grounded by him. And so we have a reason, or they have a reason, to then assign that specific role to the Father. But just to clarify sort of the model that's put forward here, they all would have sort of their own initiating acts within their sphere of activity. So the Son would do what he's doing without any interruption from the Father in whatever thing that he's assigned to do. But what the idea here is that it's the Father who assigns those spheres, and then they can then initiate their actions within those specific spheres. And so they would individually do their actions, but it will be the Father, because he is the fundamental divine person, who has a right then to assign the specific sort of spheres of activity. But I just think if you don't have that any distinction amongst them, except for them having, their own distinct consciousness, then I don't think you have any reason to say one should be chosen over the other. And I just think you just have that clash there, where you have them, having to battle it out about literally every decision that they're going to make of a non-moral nature. They have to, have a sit down and have a conversation about it. I just think that seems to be just something that's efficient, and I just don't see it as being plausible. If you have this fundamentality structure, you have a way of grounding it.
Okay, cool. So can you bring up the question again about Leftow?
Yeah, let me try to track it down now. 1 second here.
Because I think I remember the question.
Okay, I got it. So, question for Dr. Mullins: would the Eunomian objection work against oneself Trinity theories? And he mentions Leftow as an example.
So Leftow. Okay, I struggle to understand Leftow's view exactly, because in one sense it looks like a oneself view, but then he does this crazy time travel story in one paper to try to regenerate 3 centers of consciousness. And then in a later paper, he just drops the whole time travel story, which I think is for the best, because I got tired of reading so many papers about time travel and rocket dancers. And So a later paper, he's just like, I'll just drop all that. You just got 3 streams of consciousness. And I'm like, I don't know if that's really a oneself view anymore. Josh, what do you think about at least that part? Because we haven't answered the question. I'm just trying to figure out what to say.
No, I agree with you. I think it's difficult understanding. It's difficult understanding, that if you are using this self distinction, does he affirm a one self? Does he affirm a 3 self? Depends if you say, live stream is sufficient for a thing being a self. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think of a better example of something that is like really clearly a one self view. It would just be any sort of model where they'd say there's only one center of consciousness and one will in the triune life. But there's 3 persons. We just don't know what persons are, because persons mean something very different than what you modern people think. And you say modern with some sort of disdain. Does something like that seem like a good account of a one self view for you? Yeah. I think. Well, okay. I don't know if my Eunomian objection is going to work there, because I think the view is, since they refuse to tell me what a person is, I want to say you're just not articulating a doctrine of the Trinity. All you're doing is saying, I've got 3 something or others and 1 something such and such. And I'm like, well, I could say that about lots of things. I could say that to describe chocolate chip cookies. I could say that to describe the chair I'm sitting on. That's not a Trinity. Tell me what a person is, because the doctrine of the Trinity says there are 3 divine persons. So that would be the response to that kind of oneself view. I don't know. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think you just have a clear Unitarian view. I just don't think you have Trinitarianism as we sort of understand it to be 3 persons in in sort of a real sense. And so, it just wouldn't fit with any form of the understanding of the Trinity that developed in the 4th century, anything like that. So I just think even if it escapes this objection, it would have other objections. And so I just think someone should affirm something like that.
Yeah. So I guess at the end of the day, my ultimate response to this question is to say, I do not think the Eunomian objection would work against a one self view, because I think the one self view's got other things going on that really kind of prevent me from running this sort of argument, either because it refuses to define it terms, or just because it just looks like Unitarianism or something. I don't know, something kind of like that.
Right. Yeah. We got another question here. Do the majority of philosophers and theologians think that aseity is an intrinsic or extrinsic property? So going back on what you guys were debating earlier, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, it seems to me from most of the stuff I've read, they'll say it's intrinsic. So the most recent article I've read was from Lindsay Cleveland. She has this chapter just on aseity in the Analytic Theology Handbook, the T&T Clark Analytic Theology Handbook, and she says it's an intrinsic property, and she says it's taken to be an intrinsic property by all Jewish, Christian, Muslim thinkers. To which I thought, she hasn't read Josh's paper yet. So I don't know. It seems to me like the majority would say intrinsic, but Josh, I don't know if you've come across.
I'll agree with you. I think philosophers of religion, analytic theologians, what I've read, they normally assume it to be an intrinsic. But what I understand, and this is from like personal conversations with other philosophers, so a person called Gene Whitmer, who has worked with Lewis and others on formulating this criterion. I had a conversation with him, and he was saying for him, it just seems to be clearly extrinsic, given this specific condition. And so my sort of view was, well, if we are, let's say, trying to do analytic theology, we're trying to apply the tools and techniques of contemporary sort of philosophy, then, when there's sort of a consensus on the position, and I try to bring that out in the paper, specifically in the footnote, that there is sort of a consensus that this is a necessary condition for intrinsicality, then I think we need to rethink this. I think we need to say, well, if this is taken by the majority of philosophers to be necessary for a property to be intrinsic, it has to fulfill these conditions, then aseity just has to be classed as extrinsic. But obviously, if this condition and these conditions aren't in play here, then intuitively, you would probably take this to be an intrinsic thing, an intrinsic property. But then I would, and I sort of said this to Dale Tuggy in our conversation, that I would say, well, then someone needs to put forward a better criteria then of intrinsicality that fits, all of these sort of examples that we can bring. Because I was trying to say to you, and hopefully I was clear, that I think you can run through the properties and actually see that a lot of the properties that we do clearly take to be intrinsic are intrinsic according to this criteria. But I was just trying to say that actually when you play, let's say, creation through this criterion, or you put aseity through it, it seems to me that actually that's not the case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. If this is a good account of intrinsic and extrinsic properties, and if it does entail that aseity is on the extrinsic side, that would give people, I think, good reason to say, "Ooh, we should rethink this." Yeah.
Right. Thanks. We got John here saying he appreciates the discussion, so just wanted to put that up really quick. And then we had a question here. We got a couple more questions. Abdul says that Josh's intrinsicality standard seems to imply that a non-divine fundamental being is metaphysically possible. What do you think about that criticism?
I affirm the possibility of there being fundamental entities that are non-divine. I just don't think that's the case. I think when we look at the evidence, and I've sort of tried to focus on this a little bit more in recent work, that I think the only fundamental entity that is evidenced by reality is there being a divine person who is fundamental. But I mean, the majority of philosophers who work on this issue would say, yeah, you can have non-divine fundamental entities. I think it's metaphysically possible. I just don't think it's the case.
Can you bring the question up again? Because I thought I read it slightly differently.
Okay.
Okay, never mind. I read it wrong then, because I was thinking like non-fundamental divine beings. But no, never mind. Yeah. I just read it wrong.
Okay, and we've got super chats pouring in. So we've got another one here. Which of the two positions is more biblical?
Okay.
I have no idea. Josh, go ahead.
Can I take some of this? Okay,
Yeah.
So I'm really, for me, quite adamant in saying I think the monarchy of the Father is the way to go if we want to fit with the scriptural narrative about the nature of God and the historical narrative expressed at Nicaea and Constantinople. So specifically biblically, I think it's, for me, quite clear that there is an identification of the one God with the Father throughout the New Testament. And I just don't see it being the case that there is ever the Trinity assumed to be as the one God. I see that there is a trinity of persons. There is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I do believe that Scripture affirms them to be divine. But I think there is quite a clear case that the Father is taken to be the one God. He's numerically identical to the one God in Scripture. I just don't see there to be a trinity or triune God. Not to sound like Dale Tuggy, because I think I am. But I just think it's quite clear. I think it's quite clear that, but you don't have to go the Tuggian route and say, well, this affirms Unitarianism. I just don't think it does. I think it just affirms that monotheism is grounded upon the Father, but there are three divine persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I think that is the best expression of the scriptural witness. I don't know what you think.
I go back and forth on this because I do take the point that pretty much every single case you look at, when it talks about God, it does talk about the Father. When you look in the New Testament, but there are these other cases where it's kind of weird and kind of ambiguous. So like John 1, I think would be a case of this. Like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And you're like, well, that's not referring to the Father there, is it? Because it's referring to the Word. And then there's some other cases where you've got the Son being given like this very high divine status, or taking all these divine roles, like being responsible for the existence of everything and sustaining things in existence. And like, what? That's kind of weird. So there's these weird passages that I think complicate the story a bit more than that. So that's kind of why I guess where I'm like, I don't know if I could really say that it's always consistently the Father, because like the John 1 passage seems like a great case of this, where it's like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And that's not the Father.
Yeah, but I would say if it's saying that the Word is God in the same sense as, is with God, I think it's quite a clear contradiction.
Yeah.
Or that the right John or whoever wrote it just didn't understand identity or the relation. I think
maybe he didn't. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's possible, but I would just say there's a way to render it in a plausible manner, that when it says that he is God, was God, it's just simply saying that there is a divine entity here. But he was with God, and I normally use the term like nominal sense. So it's saying it's with this person who is named God, and that's the Father. And so you have the affirmation of the divinity of the Word, but then you have the identification of the one God with the Father. And I would just say, with the sort of a principle of charity in play here, that unless we do just want to say that this guy was just completely confused here, there is a way to render this as plausible, but also fitting with the other things that you were saying, that it seems to be that there's an affirmation of the divinity of the Word, there's divinity of the Spirit, clearly sort of spoken about in Scripture. And so you can have that there, but then you can just also say, well, when it's saying there is a named being called God, well, that's just referring to the Father. And so you have the one God being the Father, but yet there being three divine persons. And so, yeah, I would just say that, because I think then if you want to go with the sort of Unitarian reading of that, that's going to be difficult. And that's why I wouldn't go sort of Dale Tuggy's route, because I just think you can't really read that. I mean, unless you're going to really stretch those words, you can't read it to not affirm something as, John 1 saying he is God in some sense, that this other being is God. But with this monarchical view, you can affirm all of that. You can affirm all of the divinity passages saying he is God as the divine person is, but the one God in the named sense is the Father. And so it seems to be that you can have you can have your cake and eat it.
Right.
In a way.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you can or not.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question on that, maybe a bit more specific. So what about this doctrine of divine procession specifically? Which do you think Ryan's view is more biblical, or do you think that your view and sort of the Nicene view is more biblical?
Okay, so I think that the majority of scholars who read sort of the passages that have been, traditionally interpreted as being evidence for the eternal generation of the Son, the Spirit, is sort of referring to this incarnate state of Christ. So it's not really referring to there being an eternal generation. I think the majority of scholars hold to that. But I would just personally say, and I think this is showing my cards for my ecclesiology, but I would just say, for me, I think Scripture on a lot of issues is just underdetermined. It's affirming that there's some relation here, but I think it can be interpreted in sort of multiple ways. But then I would say, just sort of from the ecclesiology that I hold to, well, tradition has given us the interpretation that we are to affirm. And so tradition allows me to say, well, even though we can use exegetical strategies to come to this position and this position here as possible, I think tradition has declared this to be the case, that this is the rendering of this specific passage, that it is referring to the generation of the Son. But at a purely scriptural level, divorced from tradition, I think it's underdetermined. That would be my position on the matter. But I'm not a biblical scholar, so obviously,
right. Yeah. So I've got one paper on this. It's called Divine Temporality and the Charge of Arianism. When I've got the final section goes into this in some more detail. So one of the things I point out is like Josh said, like when you look at the biblical evidence and what the biblical scholars are saying, they're like, yeah, this whole causal stuff, that's not in there. And I go one step further. I point out, well, Nicaea says that this is a timeless cause with a timeless effect. But when you look at the actual biblical data, the Bible knows absolutely nothing of a timeless God and instead proclaims a God who has succession very consistently throughout. So I think what you have here is, and Nicaea is saying you've got a timeless cause with a timeless effect. Scripture saying there's no such thing as a timeless God. And we don't have any of these claims about the Father causing the Son to exist. So there's no claim whatsoever about a timeless cause with a timeless effect. So I think the biblical data really just contradicts what the tradition is saying. And then when I look at a bunch of different traditional thinkers like Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, and Augustine, the claims they say are test our claims according to Scripture. If they don't match Scripture, you're going to have to go with Scripture. And so I'm going, well, I just did. I tested it. All the New Testament scholars are saying you're wrong. I'll take you at your word and say if your claims don't go with Scripture, they'll go with Scripture. Okay, well, there we go. If your claims don't go with Scripture, so I'll go with Scripture. So in one sense, I'm being very traditional by affirming exactly what the Gregories and what Augustine tell me to do.
Right. Now, Josh, would because obviously the church fathers do think that there's these internal processions, eternal processions. What if you had to, because you said that you think that the scriptures, underdetermined, but if you had to, what passage would you go to? Maybe because the audience might not be familiar, or what sort of passages do the church fathers typically go to try to establish this doctrine? What would you think would be the strongest case if you had?
Yeah, if I'm honest, off the top of my head, passages it's not there. But I mean, you have sort of passages where it says that the Son is eternally begotten. Okay, not eternally, begotten of the Father, and then that would be sort of interpreted as him being eternally begotten. I think people are saying that it's given that there is a timeless sort of relation between them, it seems to be that he's eternally begotten. So some people would say it's referring to the generation of him in an eternal sense, but some would say that he is talking about his incarnate state, that he was begotten as a human being. If I'm honest, the passages are just not there in my head at the moment. But I would say, from sort of reading on the issue, I would just say that there is a debate to be had there. Even though scholars might be saying, okay, this is what seems to be the case here, that it's not talking about causality. I think with a lot of things, just say Scripture isn't as clear as on the matter as it could be. And so I would say when we read it then within its context of tradition, I would say that this seems to be the case, because I just seem to have a problem. I think it's a can of worms issue, that if you can just go and say, well, let's use these exegetical strategies to come to this matter, and let's say the church has held to this issue or this interpretation for a very long period of time, then my problem is, well, why shouldn't we do that with everything? And I think that's what has been happening a lot of the time. And so this sort of pushed me, so I'm not Protestant myself, so this pushed me away from Protestantism, because I just felt that divorced from tradition, you seem to have a slippery slope issue, that why can't you do that with everything? And so, for example, let's say you had Dale Tuggy here as well. Well, he would say, well, utilizing exegetical strategies, we need to affirm Unitarianism. I mean, we need to, continue this Reformation. We need to keep on continuing the Reformation and say, they didn't do enough moving away from tradition on many issues. We need to also do this when it comes to the doctrine of God. And so for me, then, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line and say, well, this is just the way we need to interpret the matter? It's an open question. I'm just trying to understand myself. Like, where do you draw the line on this specific issue?
Right. I think one of the passages they go to, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but is Proverbs 8, and the idea of the wisdom that's mentioned there. They typically try to refer that to Christ and say that there's some type of eternal generation going on there. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I'm just throwing it out there because I think that's something that they go to.
That's a common one. The standard story is to go, well, wisdom's commonly personified. And so this is just a figurative way of talking. So it can't really refer, at least not clearly. The passage Josh was referring to, I think you wanted something out of John. I just can't remember which specific passage in John where it says begotten. And then there's a passage in Hebrews as well where that's mentioned. The specific ones I'm struggling at the moment. In my if people want to go to my website and they see divine temporality and the charge of Arianism, I go case by case through each one of the individual passages that are commonly brought up there. But most of them are in John, and I think in First John, or as you would say in the UK, 1 John. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, we got a random question here, unrelated, but he sent out a super chat. Dr. Sijuwade, football related. Is it coming home?
Of course, man. Definitely coming home. Definitely. Thanks for that.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. So I do have a question for you, Josh, because I think a lot of this, and I'm going to definitely have to go back and watch this again myself, but I think that a lot of it is hinging on this intrinsic extrinsic issue when it comes to aseity, and you're arguing that it's an extrinsic property. If you were somehow convinced that it was actually intrinsic, or maybe I could put it another way, that if it actually is an intrinsic property, would that fundamentally change things as far as your view goes?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Because the other way that sort of people deal with this, and I think this, I think Mark Mackin in his paper when he was responding to Craig, I've heard Dr. Bow as well do this. So it'll normally be sort of the individual essence and general essence distinction, and so our aseity is part of the individual essence of the Father. It's not part of the individual essence of the Son and the Spirit, and so he can have it by himself, and it doesn't require the Son and the Spirit to have it. Now, my problem with that, and why I didn't go that sort of route in my paper, was because I think it's sort of begging the question, because the question is still there. Well, why is it part of his individual essence and not part of his? Why is it not part of the general essence of them? And so the only response normally I'll hear would be, well, because that's what the fathers took it to be. But then the question will still stand, well, why did the fathers take it to be that way? I mean, what's the argument there? And so for me, I think an argument needs to be formulated there. And so outside of this intrinsic, extrinsic distinction, I don't think an argument can be had for it not being part of the general essence of them and it being part of the individual essence of the Father alone. I just don't think you can have an argument there. But I'm trying to, that's with this whole thing, I was trying to put forward an argument to say, actually, we don't even need to go into this essence sort of distinction. Once we understand the nature of the type of property that our aseity is, it just seems to be the case that according to this criteria, it has to be classed as extrinsic, and so it's not problematic. But I think if it can be shown to be intrinsic, then I think there is a problem there. I think it is something that must be shared by each of the persons, and so then the argument works. But I just think that according to criterion B, it's just not had, and maybe it needs to be fleshed out in further work. But I just think that criterion sort of shows that it can't be taken as intrinsic. Right. I'm happy to be proven wrong, obviously.
And obviously, Ryan, you agree with that because you're making that argument to start. I just want to know, because at least then there's some common ground to say, well, if it is actually an intrinsic property, then Josh's model has a big problem. So I'm glad that we could kind of agree at least on that. I don't know if you have any further comment on that, Ryan, or
I do. Okay. Yeah. So one thought is, so Josh mentioned like you would have these people would say, well, the Father, it's an intrinsic property of the Father, and Josh is like, well, but why should I say that? Like, why shouldn't it be a general one? And they're like, well, because the Father said that, and I'm like, well, why did the Father say that? And well, I know what the reason is. To avoid the eunomian objection. That was the best they could do. So I want to say that's an ad hoc move. It doesn't really have good justification for it. And when people point it out, like, that seems kind of fishy. They're like, well, you learned your beliefs from the devil, and that's that. And some ineffable mystery, So I want to agree with Josh on all those points, and then go one step further and be like, I can actually tell you what the reasons were for why they said that, just to avoid the eunomian charge.
Right. And Josh, I have a personal question, because some of the viewers might be familiar. Josh and I have had a couple debates, and this issue has been brought up a couple times in our discussion. If you go back and watch, your language was very different then. You talked very much in the form of causation, and now you're talking about fundamentality and grounding relation. And I just want to say to you and the audience, I want to take credit for that. I think it's because my objections were so forceful that maybe they made sense to you and you kind of changed your view. So I want to put that out there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, thank you. As always, no, it's always great having conversations with you. It makes me think. I think over that period of time, it's quite a while ago, actually. I was just sort of rethinking the issue, because when I had finished the PhD, I was sort of in the PhD, I was defending Swinburne's model, and I hadn't really hashed out philosophically the sort of position I was trying to take myself. And then I think over the months when I was writing the building paper, I sort of was thinking more that actually seems to be the case that grounding does all that I want it to do, and I don't need to affirm this causation issue. And then I think, just over time, I just convinced myself that I think this is the way to go. And just to respond actually to something you said earlier, Ryan, about timeless causation. Again, not just to promote this grounding relation, but with grounding, because, and sorry, you were saying God is temporal, which I'll affirm as well. With grounding, you have a relation which is it's synchronic, so it has to do with time. It's saying that this thing exists at this specific time, but you don't have to affirm, atemporality there. You can have it literally being eternal in the way that you want it, but it including this sort of temporality thing, because it's to do with it being a synchronic relation. And so for me, again, you just get all that you want with there being this eternal generation of the Son. But you don't have to affirm causality. You don't have to affirm any diachronic sort of sequence of him coming about. You don't have to say, well, it's also timeless in some way. You can get all that you want with grounding, and it's not an ad hoc move, because it's something which is taken by a lot of prominent philosophers to be, a relation which is evident in reality. And so I'm just thinking, well, why can't it play a part here and capture what the fathers wanted to say, which at the time they didn't have the conceptual sort of framework there, but we have it now. And so,
I think it's a good move. And so maybe we should give people an example of this. So a common claim would be like Socrates grounds the singleton set of Socrates. You could say the same thing about God. So like, say God's eternal being. Well, God would be eternally grounding the singleton set God. And there'd be no before or after in that relation. It would be fundamental and non-fundamental, but it'd be a synchronic relation that would obtain throughout all eternity. So it seems like it could get you out of different kinds of objections as well. So one kind of objection is an Arian objection, which is that there was a time when the Son was not. And if you say something like Richard Swinburne does, which is all causes are temporally prior to their effects, well, the Father causes the Son to exist. Well, then the Father's going to exist like before and without the Son. You're like, oh gosh, that's bad. Whereas this grounding relation, you'd be like, well, grounding, not all things that are grounded are like, before or after. That's just doesn't apply. So it helps you get out of certain objections. So I can see why it could be beneficial.
Yeah, and just the last one on that as well. There's some work by a philosopher called Alistair Wilson, where he actually takes grounding to be a causal relation, and he calls it a metaphysical causation relation. And actually, in the paper, I originally started with that. Then I moved away from it just so I could put forward my first solution, which was going with your definition of arseity in that specific paper of being uncaused. well, if you had it as a causation relation, then you can't have that solution. But with the one I had, because it's analogous to causation, you can say, well, actually, they're uncaused. That was the only reason I didn't go with it. But there are some philosophers who actually take it to be a causation relation, and so he makes a distinction between a metaphysical causation relation, which grounding is, and then a nomological causation relation, which everyday causation is. And so there are different types of causation, and it's an interesting position. People like Schaeffer. He doesn't believe that. So he believes that, like I was saying, that grounding is analogous to it. It's so close to causation, but they're distinct relations.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that, I was just trying to say that there are actually some philosophers who can even say, well, you can even have the language of the fathers in a literal sense of the word, in a non-analogical sense, because it is causation, but it is a metaphysical causation relation. So, that there's a possibility there. And you also don't have the diachronic problem as well, because it's a synchronic relation. So it's just interesting that, for your sort of your viewers, Jake, I would say, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with, in metaphysics and stuff at the moment. So I think, it's good to delve deeper in it and all these sort of things to help with theological issues.
Yeah, definitely. I think people are going to have to watch this a couple times. I'm going to have to go back and watch it, but I want to get to one more question, and then what I want to do to try to help people out is maybe each one of you can sort of summarize your position and how you feel that the conversation went and what we could kind of look at going forward. But there's one last question here. Abdurrahman says, I can see how it could be a logical possibility, but under the modal scope of metaphysical possibilities you're committed to as a theist, it doesn't seem to be plausible for a non-divine fundamental being to exist. So that was kind of going back onto, I don't know, Josh, because that's maybe like a half hour ago now, but on the same guy asked the question about your position would result in the possibility of a non-divine fundamental being, and he thinks that that's problematic as a theist. So he's kind of giving a further pushback on that. I don't know if you have any further comment on it.
Yeah, just sort of understanding this question. I'm even happy to say that it's not metaphysically possible. I just didn't see the problem with it being metaphysically possible, but it's just not plausible. It's not probable given the evidence that we have. And the evidence that we have is just that there is one fundamental divine person. But I'm open to it. Personally, I don't believe that sort of my Swinburnian cards are showing again. But unless he's saying that, God exists in every logically possible world or metaphysically possible world, then that will be the case. But I don't affirm that he has to exist in every metaphysically possible world. But that's opening another can of worms.
Sure.
But I'm open to it being metaphysically impossible that there are other fundamental divine, non-divine things, and that there's only one fundamental thing, which is the Father. I'm happy to say that. But it'll be interesting to sort of maybe look deeper into that issue and see what can...
Ryan, I don't know if you have any comments on that particular objection, or
I want to agree with the objector, because like I said earlier, the concept of God is of a perfect being who is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And I do want to say that God is a metaphysically necessary being. I'm going to disagree with Swinburne on that, even though I like the Swinburne cards. Those are good cards to play. But on this one issue, I want to be like, oh, come on, man. Like, no, God's going to exist in all possible worlds. Like, that's just that. I want to say it would not be possible for there to be some other fundamental but non-divine thing.
Right. So unless you guys have any last questions, I want to give each one of you an opportunity to now kind of give a, couple minute summary of the conversation, what your position is on the matter and where you think the fundamental differences lie. And then what we can kind of look at going forward, just so we can give a neat recap to the audience. Either one of you, whoever wants to go first, it's up to you guys. It's fine with me.
Yeah. Should I go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I've affirmed the doctrine of eternal processions. Specifically, the way that I understand that is that the Son and the Spirit are grounded by the Father. And this specific relation of grounding is a directed dependence relation, and it's to do with fundamentality. So we can understand within the Trinity that there is a fundamentality structure. The Father is the one God who is the fundamental divine persons. The Son and Spirit are grounded by the Father and so are non-fundamental. Yet they are divine in that they exemplify the same divinity universal that the Father does. And so that makes them divine as he is. Now, the problem sort of we had was, well, if that's the case, then what do we do with the property of arseity? Because it seems to be that if the Father is fundamental and the Son and Spirit are not, then he is arse and he has a property that they do not have, which seems to be problematic for the doctrine of the homoousios. So the way that I tried to sort of deal with that problem was by trying to focus more on the type of property that arseity is. And I tried to argue through a certain criteria that the property of arseity is an extrinsic property. It's not an intrinsic property. And because it's not an intrinsic property, it's not required for each of the persons to possess it in order for them to be homoousios. So they can be homoousios, yet the Father still possess the property of arseity, and the Son and the Spirit do not have that. And so this framework then of the Father being the one God who grounds the Son and the Spirit is, in a way, something that I believe does not negate the homoousion doctrine, but allows them to be consubstantial. And so we can have the doctrine of the Trinity and the eternal processions as well.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Ryan, for a summary of your position.
Mm-hmm. So my position again is that the triune being is God, and the heart of the concept of God is that of this ultimate foundation of reality. And if some of the persons are not fundamental, then I just think they're not going to be part of. They're going to fail to satisfy the definition of what it means to be God. So we looked at one of these arguments called the eunomian argument, and then the revenge of the eunomian argument, which try to show that auseity is an intrinsic, essential property, a great-making property. And if the Son lacks it, then the Son's not going to be God. I need to think more about this definition of what it means to be intrinsic and extrinsic that Josh has brought up throughout the episode. I'm still not convinced that auseity is an extrinsic property, and I'm still not convinced that condition B of intrinsic and extrinsic, like the analysis that Josh gave, is actually consistent with any essential intrinsic properties. But it's something that's going to require more thought and more reflection. So, I guess I'll just leave it at that.
All right, sounds good. Any place for you guys, if you want to give to the audience to check out your work, if they want to see updates on your work, or maybe a place where they would be able to contact you if they had a question or comment? Ryan?
Mm-hmm. So you can go to rtmullins.com, where I've got most of my papers there freely available. And then you can also see different books I've got in the mix, and some that are already available and some that I'm working on. You can also check out my podcast, the Reluctant Theologian Podcast, and then you can follow me on Facebook or Twitter.
Okay, cool. How about you, Josh?
Yeah, myself is just my papers uploaded on academia.edu. You can contact me on there. You can contact me on social media. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I regularly upload my papers on there. So hopefully you can read them and enjoy them as well.
Right. And I just want to thank you guys. I appreciate you guys really a lot for coming on here. This was given some time in the making, and I think the audience enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I think I'm going to have to, like I said, I'm going to have to go back and watch it myself. I recommend that the viewers go back and watch it themselves. These are some difficult things to think about, but I hope, this conversation was illuminating for you guys and the guests as well. And look forward to future conversations. So with that being said, guys, looks like I took care of all of, this guy he sent a super sticker, but it didn't say anything. So I think we took care of everything. And until next time, guys, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.